we're about to start. I think most people are in by now. Welcome again. I'm Sean. I'm an energy engineer at Siemens and a researcher at the University of Nottingham. I'm the representative from the IET East Midlands Committee who are hosting this webinar. If you'd like to become part of a local committee or the IET, please check the website www.theiet.org. So we're very lucky this evening to have Dr. Mike Mason with us for his talk on ammonia in future propulsion and the alternatives. Mike has had an interesting career, originally a mining engineer, before moving into oil and then setting up an IT business. Mike then did a master's at Oxford in environmental change and management and went on to set up one of the first carbon trading companies, which he later sold to JP Morgan in 2008. He acted as energy advisor to the president of the Maldives, charged with making the archipelago the world's first climate neutral country before the work was interrupted by a coup d'etat. Mike has gained his doctorate recently at Oxford University in microbiology and is currently a visiting research fellow at the University of Bath's Centre for Sustainable Chemical Technology. So all in all, Mike's presentation will last about 50 minutes and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Please put any questions into the Q&A box and I'll select as many as I can at the end of the presentation to put to Mike. The comment box isn't operating today. A recording will be available on the East Midlands Committee YouTube channel within the next few weeks. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Mike. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. It's very strange talking to a lot of people without actually being able to see anyone. But I know there's some familiar names in the list and clearly lots of people I don't know. Those who are familiar will have no doubt heard me rabbiting on about this quite a lot in the past. Apologies. Ammonia and future propulsion. Aviation is one of those really hard to abate sectors and really does need some new thinking. But before we go into there, I'm just going to show you this slide, and this is very topical because it came up yesterday. Ammonia has been a bit of a backwater in energy terms for quite a long time now. It's been hanging around, people have been aware of it, but it hasn't really gained big prominence. There is a major, the world's biggest renewable energy project in Northwest Australia, largely solar, which was planning to ship 26 gigawatts of power. That's what, 40–50% of the UK's generating capacity to Singapore by wire. And yesterday they announced that they weren't going to do that. They were actually going to convert the electricity into ammonia and use ammonia in ships to transport. This is absolutely huge. This will be the world's biggest ammonia program, and it moves ammonia from backwater to mainstream. A really interesting development. So ammonia as a fuel, there are 4 questions I think we have to answer. Is it desirable? Is it possible? If it is it affordable? And finally, and perhaps most importantly of all those, is it safe? And I know that there's been some criticism from people in a famous engine company that I suspect has some people attending here, saying, no, you'll never be able to certify ammonia because it's just too unsafe. So I hope I can talk about that at the end. Is it desirable? Well, this is why it's desirable, of course. Climate change, we all know climate change is a rolling catastrophe. It's on us already. And what's the problem? Well, we're already suffering from severe problems, and yet we're only just over 1 degree centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures. The IPCC is setting some targets, I would guess. It produced a report around exceeding more than 1.5 degrees above background temperature. And even that is probably too dangerous, but it's an acceptable target. But we're bound to overshoot that. We guarantee we won't hit that without having to do a little bit of a reverse. And of course, CO2 is a cumulative pollutant. Once it's in the atmosphere, to all extents and purposes, for human purposes at least, we can treat it there as permanently. So by 2050, if you look at the graph on the right, we don't just need zero carbon, we need negative carbon. And a fair estimate would be somewhere around plus or minus 10 gigatons a year of CO2 we have to pull out of the atmosphere and bury, perhaps for as long as 100 years, to get us into a safe place. Now, give it some context, that's twice the size of the existing oil industry. But those of you who are thermodynamicists will appreciate the challenge of taking it from 400 parts per million and concentrating it to 100% instead of doing the opposite. It's not going to be easy. But it's more than CO2 if you're talking about aviation. NOx is an issue for turbines. It's a real problem. And we have a massive uncertainty around cirrus clouds. Ice in these clouds has a huge impact on radiative forcing, and it's largely seeded by the soot particles in combustion gases. So anything with carbon in is going to be a problem there. So what possible energy vectors have we got for the future? Well, on the top right, you've got kerosene. The scales here are logarithmic. You've got volumetric energy density up the right hand, up the y-axis, gravimetric on the x. Batteries are way too low. Future possible batteries are there, that purple mark. They're not actually likely to have much of a role outside a very limited amount of recreational flying. Hydrogen's really interesting. You know, there's hydrogen, that's liquid hydrogen, way off the scale in terms of gravimetric energy density, not bad in terms of volumetric energy density, but that's a liquid at 20 Kelvin. If you want to actually store that sensibly, you end up, hold on a second, here. So that's the US government target for practical storage of hydrogen. And you can see that it's a long way from where kerosene is. So hydrogen might have a role in some aircraft, but it's nowhere near as good as kerosene. So then this is the one that I hear so often being repeated by the aviation community. Ah, yes, but we'll use biofuels, we'll use e-fuels, synthetic fuels, CO2. They're an easy drop-in. But by 2040, 2050, we're going to be, as I said, negative CO2. Hold that in your mind for a second. Every ton of a carbon-based fuel emits 3 tons of CO2. Let's ignore, conveniently, the radiative forcing created by contrails and NOx and all the rest of it. 3 tons of CO2. If I just look at business as usual emissions projected for somewhere around the 2040, 2050 time horizon, they are going to be, from aviation, 2 to 4 billion tons a year of CO2. Now, if we've already got to capture, remove from the atmosphere, capture and bury 10, this adds 20 to 40% to the global CO2 capture needs. And remember, that's almost as much as the entire oil industry today. This is a huge ask. It's going to be very difficult to do. Where does the carbon come from? So people say, oh yeah, but we can use flue gases, we can use this, we can use that, we can use the other. But by 2050, there will be no convenient point sources of CO2 left. There won't be any flues, there won't be any steelworks producing it, and cement works will have to bury their own CO2. So that says, well, maybe we can use biomass. Biomass is our get out of jail free card. We can capture it with biomass. Except if you can, let's just contrast 2 different approaches here. One is to use oils directly. So a ton of palm oil is roughly equivalent to a ton of biofuel. I don't really mind what you get it from. Palm is the most efficient source of oil. And what we see is that because you end up having to deforest to produce, in essence, every incremental ton of vegetable oils has a total CO2 emission penalty of 11 tons. So not 3 tons that you have to capture, it's now 11. And of course, you also have the biodiversity losses. I don't think anyone's going to let you do that at any kind of sensible scale. So as Sean said, my PhD, my DPhil was in microbiology, and I was looking at CAM plants. This is a really interesting group of hyperwater efficient plants. They grow in semi-deserts. They're cacti, they're sisal plants, they're agave. You might know agave tequilana is used for making tequila. They're incredibly efficient nutrient users. There's lots of land we could grow them on, and there's, I know, 16,000 species, and we probably only really learned how to commercialize 3 or 4. But they too have their opportunity costs. Anything that we can ferment, we can convert to protein as an animal feed or even as human feed. And we do this bacterially. There are various Ralstonia species which produce 70 to 80% of their dry biomass weight as protein. And this is a good protein. It's more or less equivalent to casein milk proteins. Soy is the most efficient way we can grow protein. But soy has a 17:1 ratio of CO2 emissions per kilogram of protein. You're not going to be allowed to take this stuff and put it into an aeroplane. We're going to take every CAM plant we can get and convert it into proteins so that we can displace all these other things which are consuming biodiversity, because, you know, Brazilian rainforests are being cut down to do it. So proteins will have the first call on any biomass, I suspect. So that leaves you with the last of the potential energy vectors, was ammonia. It's very easily liquefied, 10 bar or minus 33 centigrade. It's not as good as kerosene, but the question is, could it be good enough? So is it possible? 1903, that was where we had. 50 years later, we were into the jet era. It is astounding the transformation that you can create in the space of 50 years. Another 50 years later, outside commercial civil aviation, we were doing some other really quite exciting things. On the other hand, in the 50 years from 1969 to 2019, we added a few windows on the top deck of a jumbo jet. The trouble with civil aviation is that you're sitting on the peak of a mountain, and almost every development that you do takes you downhill. It is very difficult to improve on what you've got without essentially getting off the mountain and moving yourself onto another one. It needs some very substantial change. So what I've done is I've built an indicative model. This is not a prediction, it's not a plan. It's a possible roadmap to truly sustainable aviation, just to demonstrate that in principle, these things are possible. So I've taken an A320 B737 class airplane. I've presumed moving it from turbofan to propeller. That plane there is a Bristol Britannia. That's actually the second plane I flew on. The first plane was a DC-3, and then we used to fly on these. Beautiful airplanes. To do that, though, you'd probably need to drop the speed from about Mach 0.85 to about Mach 0.45, 480 kilometers an hour, 300 odd miles an hour. You could probably go up a little bit higher than that. Let's assume we have to have the same maximum takeoff weight, the same payload, and fundamentally the same aerodynamics. I mean, the positioning of engines and things will change, but I'm not for the moment assuming any dramatic changes in the aerodynamics. So your engines and fuel must weigh no more than for a conventional A320 if you're going to carry the same payload. So what do you have to do to adapt to ammonia? Well, ammonia has 40% of the energy content per kilo of kerosene. If you're going to electrify that, solid oxide fuel cells, which are capable of turning ammonia into electricity, are currently quite heavy, though actually, in truth, nobody has ever asked the solid oxide industry to lightweight their fuel cells. If you swapped out steel for titanium, if you halved the thickness of it, if you did all sorts of things, I think we could go from somewhere to like about 0.3 kilowatts per kilogram up to a kilowatts per kilogram without too much dramatic change. PEM cells are a lot better, proton membrane cells, but they're destroyed by even traces of ammonia, so they're challenging. If your fuel cells are heavy, however, you have a problem, which is that you want to size them for the cruise when you're not using as much power as in takeoff. Your takeoff power is severely limited by the mass of cells, so that's a challenge. So what are the fixes? Well, the first, as I've said, is I think to move to propeller rather than jet, which increases your propulsive efficiency. You also need to move to electric power rather than combustion in the cruise, because that increases your mechanical and thermodynamic efficiency. And I'm postulating a hybrid solution using a turbine, an APU, basically to generate more power during takeoff and climb. You could burn ammonia, you can do all sorts of things. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So here we've got two graphs. On the left, we've got a comparative energy use in megawatt hours per 1,000 kilometers per engine for your A320. And on the right, we've got the same data turned into mass. If you look at the left-hand graph for a second, we've got three things there. We've got a turbofan, we've got 60% fuel efficiency and 70% fuel efficiency. And you can see the delivered energy in each case is the same. The propulsion losses are lower for the fuel cell approach. Electrical mechanical losses are tiny for the fuel cells and huge for the fan. And the fuel cell losses are there. Convert that to a mass flow at 60%, which is, I guess, where fuel cells are likely to be today. What you see is that the fuel cell approach requires a much higher mass flow rate than burning kerosene. You won't get as far with the constraints we've put on it. At 70% fuel cell efficiency, you're pretty damn close. 70% takes you almost to where you need to be. Takeoff and climb, though, is a major issue. You need additional power to gain height, which is proportional to the rate of climb. You need, and you can get that from electric motors. Electric motors are not a problem. They're incredibly power dense. And frankly, you can run your electric motor way over its nominal power rating for a short while. It just gets quite warm. So long as you cool it off afterwards, you're all right. Fuel cells are the challenge, you know, at 2,500 feet a minute climb rate, which is typical for that class of plane, you need to add 10 megawatts per engine compared to the cruise. Whereas if I think this is an ATR or something or other, a little turboprop at 1,000 feet a minute climb rate, you only need to add 4 megawatts, which is a much more reasonable amount. So you're probably going to end up with a much slower climb, but it'll be a quieter climb. And the simplest solution to that extra power, I think, is probably a turbine, somewhat similar to an APU. It could burn ammonia. There might be an emissions problem without an ammonia to hydrogen cracker. The problem you have with burning ammonia is that for a brief instant, you have nitrogen free radicals hanging around where there's oxygen. Now, the thermodynamics drives the reaction towards N2 plus H2O, but these are equilibrium reactions, and you may well find yourself with a little bit too much NOx in the exhaust. Interestingly enough, if you just introduce a little bit of ammonia in the back end of the exhaust, the ammonia reduces the NOxes back to nitrogen, but that's a separate approach. You could even burn a little bit of biofuel or e-fuel because you only need a relatively small quantity. You know, efficiency isn't a major issue. You only need it for 20 minutes of the flight. So your fuel and efficiency are much less important than for the cruise. And of course, turbines, very high power to weight ratio. So what does this look like in practice? Your ammonia fuel, apologies, it's a non-COVID cough. Ammonia fuel flow rates higher than kerosene. Your electric motors are higher than your turbofans, which compensates somewhat. The APU adds a little bit of extra weight, but the fuel cell power density is the great unknown. So what I've plotted here on the y-axis is a range of possible power densities that we might achieve, ranging from 0 at the bottom to 4 kilowatts per kilogram. And on the x-axis, what we have is the range that you would get from the plane at each of those things. And what you can see, follow the red line for a moment, the blue line's a bit more speculative. The red line says 60% fuel efficiency. I don't believe it's going to be particularly challenging to get us to a power density of about 1 kilowatt per kilogram. And that gives you a 5,000 kilometer range. No reserves clearly in there, so take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. Push the fuel cell efficiency up to 70%, and you're talking about range of almost 7,000 kilometers. That's quite a big difference. In practice, that's what it means. You can get an awful lot of the world included in your range. So the prize is huge. It would be quieter, it would be non-emitting. It could become, aviation could become the most sustainable form of transport. Because of course, you don't need much land take, a lot less than rail or road. No intrusive noise. It'll be a lot faster than all the alternatives. It'll be safer than the alternatives. It's flexible, it's responsive. You know, once you've built your railway, you can't move it tomorrow because demand patterns have changed. And it has unlimited growth potential. You could move aviation from ecological, environmental pariah to a saint, a savior. Range is lurking there as an issue, but I'm going to be bold and say, you know, we've got to move off our mountain onto another one. I've got a little commercial drone from DJI, and I can position it within 100 millimeters in 3-dimensional space at the touch of a button. The software for doing these things is easy. Mid-air refueling, well, look at the picture on the right, it's 100 years old. And, you know, the President of the United States, bless him, flying in Air Force One, regularly refuels. It's safe enough for him, it's probably safe enough for everybody else. Don't underestimate what artificial intelligence, increasing computer power, vastly improved control systems will do to safety and our ability to do things like this. It's not as silly an idea as it might first seem. So then is it affordable? It's all very well having the technology, but who's going to pay for it? So the cost of ammonia is mostly electricity, and then it's the cost of electrolyzers. To make green ammonia, what you do is you take water, you electrolyze it, produce hydrogen, oxygen, then you combine the hydrogen with nitrogen from the air in a process called the Haber-Bosch process, and that's 120 years old and pretty efficient, quite capital intensive though. Solar power in sunny deserts is already $13.50 a megawatt hour. It's fairly low cost. Perovskite tandem cells are being developed at the moment. They will be launched probably this year, and they will reduce the cost of solar power probably to less than $10 a megawatt hour by 2030. That's almost free. And generation 3 ammonia is really interesting. This is coming out of a lab at Monash University in Melbourne in Australia, led by Doug McFarlane, and he has developed a technique for producing ammonia directly in the electrode of the electrolyzer. So the whole Haber-Bosch thing goes away. So if we look at the bar chart there on the right, the first column, the tallest column, is 2020 solar powered Haber-Bosch ammonia, and it's showing the cost per megawatt hour on a lower heat value basis, and it's around $100. 20 of that, I mean, there's a conflict between what I'm saying, which is it's already $13.50 a megawatt hour. I've got in 20 there, I'm being a bit more conservative. And the conversion cost from hydrogen to ammonia and the cost of the fuel cells, sorry, not of the fuel cells, of the electrolyzers is the bulk of the cost, $85. By 2030, with more efficient solar cells and much lower cost electrolyzers, we see that cost coming down to $65, $70 a megawatt hour. Now, the big change there, apart from the solar cell cost coming down, is electrolyzers. Electrolyzers today are around $900 to $1,000 a kilowatt. But there are already reports coming out of China at around $200. Well, I'm forecasting by 2040, 340. I think these are probably out of date already. Nonetheless, we'll stick with the numbers that we've got there. By 2040, if you've got generation 3 ammonia synthesis, and you've got what I think is going to happen with solar power, you're talking about costs of $35 a megawatt hour, 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That's what, 35 US cents per liter of kerosene. This is very, very cost effective. So what does that mean for your aircraft? The graph, the inset graph at the bottom shows you the fuel cell efficiency. Is just a reminder for what is making this happen. What I've got on the graph on the right is the delivered energy cost, bearing in mind the different fuel cell compared to combustion efficiencies. And I've used 60% efficiency. You've got 3 lines there and 2 dotted lines. The 2 dotted lines, the red one is kerosene without any CCS today. Now that's a 2020 price. Kerosene today is unbelievably cheap because nobody wants to buy it because no one's flying their aeroplanes. So aviation fuel is almost being given away, but that's the price today. The price, the green dotted line is the price of kerosene with $100 a ton of CO2 added. The purple line shows you the cost per megawatt hour of delivered energy at a given cost of capital for producing that delivered energy, you see on the x-axis. And you can see that ammonia is today going to be more expensive than kerosene, and it would need a fairly chunky carbon price to make it viable. By 2030, that's starting to change. A really reasonably modest carbon price makes ammonia cost effective, but it's struggling against no carbon price kerosene. By 2040, that's all changed. By 2040, ammonia powered aviation is just cheaper than kerosene powered aviation, even if there is no carbon price. If there's a carbon price, it beats it hands down. But of course, that's not the only thing. I know fuel is a huge part of this, but electric motors are not like big gas turbines. They're dead cheap to run. They don't need maintenance. Either they work or they don't work. Fuel cells have very few moving parts. The fuel cell itself is solid. And so I suspect that maintenance is also going to come down dramatically. So there is the case for doing it and for paying it. The really difficult question is it safe? So the first thing we have to think about is fire. Now, since the explosion in Beirut, I've had countless people saying to me, yes, but that was ammonia, wasn't it, that blew up on the docks in Beirut? No, it wasn't. It was ammonium nitrate. I'm originally, as Sean said, a mining engineer. Ammonium nitrate is an explosive. We used it to blow up things. Ammonia itself is almost completely non-flammable. It requires a high ignition energy. it's got a very narrow flammability limit. So the quote there is from the IIAR Handbook of Ammonia, and it notes that ammonia is designated as a non-flammable gas for shipping purposes by the United Nations and the US Department of Transportation. It is very, very difficult to set ammonia on fire by accident. And the fact that it's a gas and is lighter than air, and we'll come to that shortly, it diffuses readily. It's very difficult to create a flammable situation indoors. You could burn it, of course, in a turbine, but that's not indoors. The real problem with ammonia, the real problem is that ammonia vapor is lethally toxic at concentrations greater than about 3.5 grams per cubic meter. It's survivable, but very unpleasant at sort of a half that to 3,000, 3,500. And below that, it's not at all pleasant, but it has the advantage that it's detectable at parts per billion. So what are the safety implications of ammonia for aviation? We can more or less ignore the scenario on the right, which is a tank farm burning. On the ground, ammonia has been handled and stored for 100 years, even in the middle of urban areas, negligible risks. The heart of Rotterdam, there is a current liquid ammonia store of 30,000 tons in the middle of the city. Nobody bats an eyelid, it's not an issue. Fire risk is dramatically reduced compared to kerosene. So in accidents at height or accidents with no survivors, ammonia poses no additional risk. There are two types of accidents that really matter that we need to look at. One is survivable crashes, and the other is crashes into populated areas. And the key questions are, how large are the risks and can we mitigate them? So as an answer, in answer to this, I, over the last lockdown, analysed every single civil aircraft and cargo aircraft crash over the last 20 years, 2000 to 2019 inclusive. And it was clear, first of all, that trying to do this per billion passenger kilometers was the wrong metric, because nearly all the crashes are on arrival and landing or depart or takeoff and climb. So it had to be per passenger journey. The graph on the right has two lines. We've got, firstly, the blue line, which is crashes per billion journeys. And you've got a very, very strong trend downwards there. And you've got deaths per billion journeys, and that's going down even more steeply. And that's largely because there are quite a lot of survivable crashes. When I say crashes, I mean, you know, an aircraft going off the runway and the undercarriage collapsing counts in this case as much as anything else. But a lot of survivable crashes. What we can say is that regardless of fuel, the risks are falling fast and will continue to do so. And any ammonia-powered aircraft will be new. They will benefit from massively improved AI, control systems, and the incredible reliability of electric motors. And of course, because electric motors are unusual, unlike a combustion motor, or a jet, where if you increase the size, you increase the efficiency, there is no efficiency gain for going for bigger and bigger. So you can easily have a no power to weight ratio gain particularly. So you can easily have half a dozen 3 to 4 megawatt motors distributed across the aeroplane rather than two large combustion engines. So looking carefully at the risk in survivable crashes, because we've already agreed that the unsurvivable ones aren't really important, and looking at those where there were survivors at risk, there are an awful lot of them you can eliminate because they're runway excursions, there's minimal or no fuel tank damage, and there are no survivors at risk in particular. Many crashes, of course, involve fires, It was remarkable how often in the crash reports you heard on the ground rescuers saying they could hear people alive and they couldn't get in because of the fire. This we can dismiss as a problem for ammonia. If you look at the table on the right, what I've done is I've very simply and crudely extrapolated the decadal change in the number of crashes, deaths, and on the right of the column, I want you to focus on survivors at risk, and extrapolated that data for the next 3 decades. And what you see is in the 2040 to 2049, it gets fainter because, of course, you know, as you go further into the future, one is less and less and less confident. But taking those numbers at face value, you've got something like 10 to 15 survivors at risk per billion journeys in that period. The odds of being struck by lightning in a year are 10 times as high. So this is not a real risk that we should be frightened of. It's a risk, and we will have to try and mitigate it. We can mitigate it, but it's not a showstopper. Much the more serious risk emerges as being the risks in urban crashes. And relevant urban crashes are not reducing. I don't have hard evidence for this, but my guess is that there are 2 reasons. One is that the number of flights is just increasing, and the other is that those flights are increasing most rapidly in places which have the least infrastructure, safety culture, and the like. If you look at the pie chart on the right there, of the 21, I've excluded the 3 urban crashes caused by terrorism in New York. Of the other 21 crashes that occurred into an urban setting or an urban area, 4 were in the Republic of Congo, 2 were in the DRC, 2 were in Nigeria, and you can read around clockwise. Almost none of them were in places with a very strong safety culture and a strong regulatory environment. It's also important to note that most of those crashes were very old aircraft. You know, we've got a 707, Boeing 707 there. We've got a DC-3 crashing. One crashed because it ran out of fuel. Well, that wouldn't have been an issue. Most of the aircraft were small aircraft. I said less than 35 tons of fuel capacity. Most of them were much smaller than that. A lot of old Russian freighters running around Africa. Half the aircraft were greater than 40-year-old designs, and over half of the aircraft were on landing at the end of long legs, so they would have been low on fuel anyway. Nonetheless, we do have to mitigate the risks. So there are 2 risks with ammonia vapor. One is a toxic plume developing from a simple spill, a vast pool of ammonia that comes out of the tanks. Liquid ammonia, however, has a very high specific heat and a high latent heat of vaporization. It doesn't vaporize very easily. The graph on the right is US EPA data, again from the IAR report, showing evaporation rates from a pool of ammonia liquid, a centimeter deep, starting at a range of different temperatures. So, you know, 20 and 40 degrees, they've taken liquid ammonia, depressurized it, and then put it in a 15-mile-an-hour wind. But as you get towards the left of the graph, and we're talking about a liquefaction temperature of -33 and a freezing temperature of -77, what you see is that it's almost impossible to evaporate this stuff. There isn't enough heat in air to deliver the energy needed to make the phase change. It's very difficult to do. So imagine your crash site is 200 meters long, 50 meters wide. You've spilled the fuel evenly across it, the worst possible case. Your maximum evaporation rate would be less than 2 kilograms per second if the fuel was -77. It would take you 10 minutes to evaporate a ton. Assuming no diffusion, and we know ammonia is lighter than air, assuming no mixing, assuming no turbulence, it was difficult to get no turbulence in a 15-mile-an-hour wind, and assuming that it doesn't rise, so the whole thing is contained to 2.5 meters deep and 100 meters wide, the concentration would be less than 1200 milligrams per cubic meter. So this is not a good place to be, but it's not fatal. So what you can say is that creation of a potentially fatal toxic plume from a simple spill is really hard. There is a much bigger risk, and it's the formation of mists. In the 1940s, after the Second World War, there were a lot of spare aeroplanes lying around. So the US, the predecessor to NASA and the FAA, went and crashed a whole lot to look at how they could improve fire safety. And what they realized was that the big problem was the formation of a mist in the 0 to 20 or 30 seconds after the crash. One of the other things to note is that small droplets increase vapor pressure and enhance evaporation rates. So now suddenly you've got a huge surface area. You still, of course, don't have any more heat in the air. It's very difficult to evaporate it, but you have got conditions working against you. So the greatest risk with ammonia probably comes from ammonia in post-crash misting, in an urban crash, creating a toxic plume. It's very difficult to model. It needs some experimental work, and I'm hoping to do some of that shortly. So that's the real risk. We have to mitigate that one. Of course, mitigating that one will mitigate all the others as well. And I'm going to propose 3 approaches. One is just fill the tanks with a foam. Foam-filled tanks have been used by the military for a very long time to stop fuel sloshing around, to reduce fire risks, to reduce in-tank fires and explosions. If you have multiple compartments, and if you surround the tank with a fiberglass layer, just loose fiberglass, not in resin, or something like that, to act as a coalescer for droplets, that would make a huge difference, and you would get a very limited amount of misting, I suspect. Option 2 is a really interesting one. Put your ammonia into the tank with or without foam as an ice slush, and then freeze it with by passing some liquid nitrogen through. And you could have a loose matrix of fibers in the tank to hold it together. Solids don't form mists. And of course, you've also got the latent heat of fusion to take into account. This becomes a very stable fuel. And you can scavenge the liquid ammonia off, or the solid ammonia, with liquid ammonia to feed into the engine. A very interesting approach. And then the other one that is also interesting we should be aware of is rheology modifiers. Everyone will now know about hand sanitizers. You know, you put some on your hands and it's quite gloopy, but actually it's 70 to 75% ethanol, or it might be isopropanol, but one of those. And it's gloopy because a tiny percentage of a rheology modifier has been added to make a sort of honey-like consistency. It's very difficult to make a mist out of honey. And so one thing that I think we probably need to explore is whether we can use rheology modifiers for liquid ammonia to make this sort of honey-like consistency. What about the passengers? Well, I don't think there's a serious risk there, but of course, you can give passengers a mask. Ammonia is incredibly easy to neutralize. Citric acid does the job. Ammonium citrate's a perfectly safe product. It's actually a food preservative. And I did a sum, sort of 75 grams of citric acid in those little blocks on the side of your face mask could give you 15 minutes of safe breathing at up to 40,000 milligrams per cubic meter. I'm not aware of any lives that have been saved by the life jackets that we all have to practice using or watch the stewards and stewardesses using. Masks might be much more useful. I just leave that one as a thought for the safety people. Environmental risks I need to quickly deal with. Ammonia leaks could disturb the global nitrogen cycle. It's a major issue for fertilizers, but other than a rare gross leak, ammonia as a fuel is not a serious risk. You can smell it so easily that leaks are easily detected. NOxes, I say, are powerful greenhouse gases. They can be avoided in fuel cells. In combustion, we can avoid NOxes by adding a trace of ammonia at the back end or by cracking thermally before combustion. So I think we can handle both of those. So where does that leave us? Well, is it desirable? Absolutely. Ammonia is a really rare, sustainable fuel. There aren't many others. If you cast your mind around the periodic table and think, well, in an aeroplane, lift and drag are intimately related. I want to reduce the weight so that I reduce the drag, so I reduce the thrust, so I reduce the amount of energy I need. I need a fuel which, when oxidized, I can throw away. There's not much you can throw into the atmosphere. You can't throw silicon, you can't throw boron, you can't throw carbon. Nitrogen's about the only thing. Is it affordable? Well, I believe it will be. I think it will be cheaper than biofuels, cheaper than e-fuels, and even cheaper than kerosene is today. Is it possible? I think so. I think there's R&D to do. It's not a done deal, but it's a really, really promising approach, which I think is grossly underestimated and under-researched. Is it safe? I think it could be. I think it could actually be safer than kerosene. I think fire is a horrible thing, and we can avoid fire, and with decent fuel tank design, with careful thought about how we handle fuel, whether we use rheology modifiers, whether we use it as a solid, we could make ammonia safe. Aviation, therefore, could become the most sustainable form of transport that we have, other than the bicycle. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Mike. Thanks for your really insightful talk there. We've had quite a few questions coming through, and anybody watching still, if you have any, please keep them coming through. Mike's going to answer a few, or we'll try and get through as many as we can. So Mike, there's a question here from Ian Mitchell. We hear a lot about hydrogen as a fuel in trains and trucks. Is ammonia an appropriate solution for these as well?
I would put ammonia and hydrogen as sisters. In essence, ammonia is nitrogen as a hydrogen carrier. So I think it's probably it's a false dichotomy to set one against the other. I think ammonia is much easier to handle. It's much, much easier to move around, and it's going to be much cheaper than hydrogen, because if you're making hydrogen from wind in the UK at $40 a megawatt hour and ammonia from electricity in Morocco at $10 a megawatt hour, you've got a huge cost differential. So I don't think it's a matter of knocking one or the other. I think the economics will just play out in favor of ammonia. And this large scheme that's just been launched in Australia, if it actually happens, will be transformative in that space.
Okay. We have another one here from Daniel Morris. Hi, Mike. Fuel dumping is a normal procedure for aircrafts. Where does that leave ammonia? It's an occasional procedure. Yes, it happens. Yes, it happens when you least want it. And I think you're going to have to plan it. If you dump your fuel at high altitude, remember, the ammonia molecule is lighter than air. So you will get a downward plume because it's cold, and it will diffuse. You might have to be careful. It might need to be something that you think quite hard about. It might mean you need to change things like undercarriage design so that you can land with higher loads. There are going to be implications. I don't think those are insurmountable, though. Mm-hmm. Okay. And from Nick Cook, what is the efficiency of converting electricity to ammonia? E.g., how many units of electrical energy are required to produce 1 kilogram of ammonia?
Right. So this is a question that keeps being thrown out and really merits some thought. The efficiency is completely irrelevant, because what you're doing is you're taking sunshine, which is currently being thrown away, in a place where it can't be used, and turning it into energy you can use. No form of renewable energy has a useful energy metric attached to it, except possibly hydro. Wind, how do you measure the energy efficiency of wind? The energy that's available to you is quite different to the amount you extract. Efficiency really matters when you're paying for your fuel. So if you're paying, $1 a litre for your fuel, then you want to get the maximum possible out of it. efficiency matters for your solar panels and the process because it does affect the capital cost. But in terms of a metric of how much energy do you input, it's not very useful. But let me try and give you more conventional answers to that. Your solar panels are going to be probably 20 to 25% efficient, maybe 30% efficient in the next few years. Your electrolyzers, 70, 75% efficient. Haber-Bosch, 90% efficient. So there you have it. And those are numbers, but they don't mean anything. 5% of Western Australia covered with solar panels would replace the entire energy requirements of the planet, and there's another 95% to go for. And then there's all the Atacama Desert and the rest.
Okay, another one from Colin McNaught. What about the risk of contact, temperature and toxicity at skin contact?
Yeah, don't do it. Contact risks are completely manageable. Nobody expects to touch an 800-volt electrical feed to a motor and survive it either. You're going to have to design systems around this. But remember, BMW were doing liquid hydrogen refueling at 20K 20 years ago. And that's much more serious. So lots of challenges, lots of engineering detail here. What I was trying to do was convey the broad thermodynamic possibilities of it rather than solve all the problems. There's engineering to do.
Of course. There's a kind of follow-up question here from F. Wilson, and I suppose it's to do with the publicity side of things as well. How do you convince airports, their workers and passengers to accept using a toxic fuel? I know you've touched on that already, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
So since when is kerosene not toxic? And it also makes a big bang. Look, something has to change. We know that aviation in its current form cannot continue. So the question is not how do you convince people, but it's what is there out there that is even possible to do? And there aren't many other things that are possible. So then you say, okay, you have to convince them. Michael O'Leary is interesting. He convinced people to vote his airline as the world's worst airline and the world's most popular airline. People are driven by price, they're driven by economics, and I suspect airports will follow the people.
Okay, we've got a couple of similar questions here to do with industry and what the interest has been in the industry, and also questions linked to is it a better win to get this started on the ground or at sea first before we look at aviation? There has been some work, I know, R&D work in Denmark and Norway on cargo shipping and ammonia-ready engines there. But what do you think the interest has been from the aviation industry and then also from other transport industries?
So shipping is interesting. I was at a dinner a little while ago, which we had some of the senior people from the world shipping industry, and the IMO have now decided that ammonia has a huge future. MAN reckon that 50% of their engines are ammonia ready or will be in the next few years. Shipping will be the first to go over, I am absolutely certain. Aviation is interesting because, as I said, it's, safety in aviation is a religion. And you have an industry which sits at the top of its little mountain, and everywhere you go from here is down unless you can go to another mountain. And so, if you take a company that's struggling today because it makes its revenue by power by the hour, it's very difficult to get them interested in something 20 years hence. I think that the timescales of research in this space are going to be long. We have to get on with it. Otherwise, we won't be ready by 2040. I think it's going to blow a lot of people's business models out. I can see the airframe manufacturers seeing electrification as an opportunity to do much more integration of power systems into the airframe and capturing business from the power from the engine manufacturers. I can see engine manufacturers who have a business model which relies on essentially long-term maintenance of expensive pieces of capital that are very, very finicky and need a lot of love, care and attention, finding their business model struggling. We're at a very early stage. I hope that a talk or two like this is going to stimulate some of that interest, but I think it's going to run against the grain of many people's views of what their business model would be.
Certainly. I think you might have touched on this one already, but a switch to ammonia requires a completely different global system of production, distribution and combustion, whereas e-fuels can be used with existing infrastructure and airplane technology, and it can be adopted in a gradual way. Transitioning to e-fuels appears much easier than to ammonia. How long do you think it would take to move to ammonia?
This is a fundamentally important point. And e-fuels are great. It's like getting onto the slip road of a motorway that's closed. The problem with e-fuels is that they are very, very seductive, but you're going to have this problem of where do you get your CO2 from? The only place you can get it from in the long term is the atmosphere. And that's going to come with all sorts of competitive tensions, because we need to take 10 gigatons a year out of the atmosphere, and you're going to add 40% to that currently almost impossible workload. Just deploying the kit to do that is an astronomical task. So, if we had all the time in the world, and if there was no constraint on cost, I think you would do it. E-fuels will be more expensive than ammonia, make no mistake. E-fuels will be 2 to 3 times as expensive as ammonia per delivered megawatt hour. And I think cost will be the ultimate driver. The question is, are you going to be in the right place at the right time? It won't happen everywhere. A bit like shipping, what's happening with shipping is some places, Singapore, I suspect to be one, some places are going to establish trunk routes for ammonia-fueled ships to travel between them. And those trunk routes will gradually expand. You can see London, New York, you can see Singapore, Sydney, you can see a few of these growing. How it's going to happen, I don't know. I wait to see.
Very good. Yeah, a couple of people mirroring your comments about just the question around industry buy-in and the conservative approach to design that currently stands in aviation. There's another question here from Alex Wood, which is quite a good one, I think. What interest is there from government?
You heard it here first. So this is the second time I've had this talk. The first actually spawned this one. That was to the Future Propulsion Beacon at Nottingham University. We're right at the beginning of this journey. I'm hoping that in due course we will manage to get governments interested and listening and funding. And I hope that quite a lot of the audience who are involved in the space and in the industry will take this story out and say, actually, there's something in this. It isn't all there, it isn't all right, but we should be looking at it. We can't afford not to.
Good one here again from Richard Creek. Is there, well, this is a specific one, I'm not sure. Is there an interest in ammonia boring as a means to store and transport ammonia in solid state versus liquid storage?
Boranes are really interesting. They're horribly explosive. And I'm not sure why you would want to use them to transport it. You're just transporting a lot of boron around. Ammonia is very safe and very easy to transport. In the States, there are tens of thousands of miles of pipelines piping ammonia all over the agricultural heartlands. As a transport, I don't think that solves the problem. The interesting question is whether things like the boranes would be better hydrogen carriers as fuel. They're less stable, which doesn't make them easy. But you have this other problem, which is what are you going to do with all the boron? You've then got to carry the boron the whole flight. So you end up with some of the same problems as batteries. I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. These are all alternatives to nitrogen as a hydrogen carrier. And certainly we need to not listen to me saying, oh, I don't think it'll happen, but actually evaluate it, do the sums, do the tests, do the experimental work, and then make a conscious decision that it should or shouldn't be used.
Great. There's another one here just on the government side. I would suggest hybrid vehicles using dirigibles with helium as another option. I suggest we need a Clean Aviation Act which enables any technology and includes incentives for any technology. Now would be a time to offer the industry incentives to change. It's not necessarily a question, but just a
statement. That's my simple response to that.
Another one on timescales, again, more of a statement than a question. Shipping is not likely to shift to ammonia until 2040 by retrofit. It would be too late for planes at that point.
I'm not sure that's true. I think I know that the world's first ammonia-powered ship is currently being built.
Yeah, it was. There was an article on the BBC this weekend, wasn't there?
Yes,
talking about it.
There was. MAN engines are convertible directly to ammonia. They reckon that 50% of their engines could be run on ammonia with minor modifications. So, shipping is the one place where it is going to be relatively easy. And I know that the IMO are discussing this quite seriously and with a fairly short time horizon.
Got a so it's quite a general one. What's the single biggest obstacle to progress this idea? That's a big question.
Oh, human inertia.
Okay.
If we said we've got to do this, look, we've just developed a COVID vaccine in 9 months and tested it, and it works. Previously, people would have said 5 to 10 years, but we wanted to do it and we did it. If we recognize that there are lots of false routes that are going to lead you into places that are ultimately unsustainable in aviation, they might be quite useful. They might be quite useful interim stages, e-fuels, biofuels. I can see them having a role between now and 2040, 2050. But if we said we want to do this, we could do it. We're not fighting physics. We're not fighting thermodynamics. Actually, what we're fighting is human inertia and regulation.
Will ammonia work with VSS Unity?
With what?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that one is. We can skip over that.
Well, I'm interested to know what it is, but yeah, skip over it. But if the questioner would like to come back, I'm really keen to know.
So what interest is there from a defense perspective? On-site fuel production, security of supply, long lifetime equipment, etc.
Pass.
Pass. I think we're pretty much coming to the end now. We've got quite a lot of the same questions coming up.
There's one from Simon Hart, who I think I know, saying, could I see onboard cracking, which I'd like to just come to. Because
yeah.
Onboard cracking is really interesting. You could crack to hydrogen and use the hydrogen in PEM cells. And that would be very interesting because then you could use hydrogen or ammonia and it helps the glide path into ammonia. The problem is that PEM cells are really challenging because they need ultra pure hydrogen. However, only yesterday, talking to Bill David, Professor David, who wrote the Royal Society report on ammonia, he said, well, 10 years ago in the lab, they had 6 nines quality hydrogen from cracking ammonia. So I think this might be just a technology problem. But the other thing that's really interesting is that a mix of about 30% hydrogen, 70% ammonia, I think is the right number, is a drop-in into existing turbines with almost no modification. And you could easily crack your ammonia down to that. You need the hydrogen ammonia blend to manage things like fuel speeds, flame speeds, and so on. So there may be some interesting glide paths that need exploration.
Very good. So on the VSS Unity point, it stands for Virgin Stratosphere Cruiser. Don't know if that helps at all.
Ah, yeah, Richard Branston's wonderful toy. Know nothing about it at all. Look, one of the really interesting things about the sorts of things that he is doing, and you know, people like reaction engines building rocket engines that run on atmospheric oxygen until they run out of it, is that you could imagine a really long range, you know, London to Los Angeles or to Sydney type stuff outside the atmosphere completely, in which case you don't have an issue. I don't quite know where that would go. I don't think it's a majority sport, frankly. I think that it's kind of outside my time horizon for avoiding the catastrophe of climate change, but it's really interesting stuff.
We're getting quite a lot of praise coming your way, Mike. You'll be happy to know. Just people saying they appreciate your can-do attitude, and people are quite excited about it. They're saying they want to crack on and change the world now. It's a very interesting topic. There's another one here from Matthew Bates. Large-scale storage at airports could be required. Chilled storage requiring compressors, fan coolers, annulus tankers. Is the storage comparison versus hydrocarbon fuel, in brackets, floating tank and pumps, and distribution network under review?
This is going to be different to hydrocarbons because you can store hydrocarbons at ambient temperature and ammonia you can't. You either have to pressurize it or you have to chill it, and I'm going to suggest that chilling it is much safer, easier, better. We already know how to do this. Ammonia is stored all over the world in large quantities. As say, in the middle of Rotterdam, there's 30,000 tons. It's not a difficult thing to do. It will be different. It will require more volume. It will require insulation. You won't have the same sorts of things. There will be extra costs. It will be more expensive than kerosene to move.
We've got one here from John Fletcher. What is the chemical reaction that releases energy from ammonia?
Right, you've got two options. One is you burn it, in which case you go NH3 goes to N2 plus H2O, and the hydrogen basically combining with oxygen releases heat. The other is that you do exactly the same thing in a fuel cell and you produce electric power instead. And so you generate electricity, and that you then use to power electric motors.
One here from Daniel Morris. Is the answer to disassociate ammonia into hydrogen and ammonia mix prior to combustion to solve or reduce the NOx issues?
Absolutely right, yes. So if you're going to burn it, you don't have to be totally pure. You can disassociate it. Burning it, of course, has the disadvantage that you lose the thermodynamic gains that you get by just going down the electricity route. But again, it may be on the glide path, and it may be what we use for short range stuff.
So Colin Megson's just asking if the YouTube URL will be made available. Yes, the IET will send you a link to the YouTube site for the East Midlands Committee. And I've got three more here. Yes, more of a statement from Grant. It is easier to make the ships. Getting the dirty ammonia is easy. Getting zero carbon ammonia at scale is the hard part. The Committee for Climate Change plans for the ammonia change after 2040 for ships. That makes sense.
Yeah, but I think it's wrong.
Okay.
I think what's interesting, look at this announcement yesterday of 26 gigawatts, not megawatts, gigawatts of ammonia capacity being built. Now, those ships are not going to be fueled on kerosene, on diesel, on heavy fuel oil. They're going to be burning the ammonia that they're carrying. In other words, we've already announced the world's first ammonia shipping.
Again, a lot of love coming your way. A lot of people saying brilliant presentation. And congratulations. So the last two, I think, we haven't had any more new ones come through in a while. The reduction in commercial aircraft speed would be a major factor in uptake if the technology is okay. Can aircraft speed be increased to current speed using variable pitch propellers with efficient airfoils?
Can it be increased to that? Not without sacrificing a considerable amount of efficiency. Now, the Russians had the world's fastest propeller-powered aeroplane. It was a Ilyushin something or other, and it was capable of doing about 500 miles an hour. So I leave that to the aerodynamicists. What I would say about time, though, is that the reason we have a 3-hour check-in time is mostly so that we can go and buy perfume. It seems to me not implausible that we could dramatically reduce transit times into and onto an aeroplane. Also, if you're doing propeller-powered aviation, which is quieter, which require shorter runways, which is generally more civic friendly, you could run from very many places. An awful lot of people would have shorter journeys because they don't have to go to Heathrow to get on the aeroplane. So there'll be swings and roundabouts. Yes, there are, we can't have what we've got. We will lose some things. We might gain more than we're expecting, though, in other places.
Brilliant. I think we've managed to clear the Q&A box. So if everybody's happy, again, a lot of people coming through and saying thank you, very interesting talk, excellent talk. So once again, from the IET and East Midlands Committee, thanks for presenting.
Well, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I hope people take away from this the fact that there's something really interesting and new out there, and go and stimulate other people to think about it and talk about it.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.